Okay, so welcome back to Racial and Ethnic Relations. This week, we are going to be discussing two things. The paper that you read of mine on the Black middle class, and we're going to be talking about cultural appropriation. So essentially, we're going to be discussing race, class, and cultural appropriation. Um, First thing I want to remind you of is that your papers are due. I know some people have sent me their papers early, so I'm going to get those back to you very soon so that you can make whatever changes you need to make. And then you can apply those to your final paper. So I think that's the only update we have. Other than that, we can go right into the lecture. So first, I'm going to start with the paper, the chapter that you were supposed to read, the book chapter that was uploaded. Black people have money now, so why are they still complaining? Exploring the fragility of the Black middle class. This was a book chapter that I wrote, and that was I wrote a couple years ago, and that, or maybe it was last year, something like that, last year, 2 years ago, and I got published last November. And it looks at this idea of class, particularly within the race. Now, we've talked about that in kind of a more implied way, but we haven't really explicitly discussed the Black middle class or the Asian working class or the Latino poor or the Native American rich, or anything like that. So with this, we're gonna explicitly talk about the Black middle class, and the Black middle class, and even the middle class of any minority group. There is a specific line of literature that deals with that helps us understand how nuanced racialized experiences can be in the United States. Just because a person is of a certain race, a lot of it does mean that they will likely have similar experiences, but because of things like gender, because of things like class, because of things like sexuality and other intersecting identities, this can change people's experiences within the US context. And so that is what we look at when we look at class. And so essentially what this paper does is it helps us understand the complexities of the Black middle class, how the Black middle class came to be, particularly in the 20th century, but then it also looks at the differences between the Black middle class and the white middle class, and then also looks at some of the disparities that still exist even within this privileged population. So it looks at some of these misconceptions. It starts with some of these misconceptions about the Black middle class, looking at the fact that if Black people are at this middle class, upper middle class position, then this must mean that racism no longer exists, or you have these people that were once oppressed that now they're living like their white counterparts. This must mean that the system in America is working, right? So this must lead us to this kind of meritocratic conversation, or this kind of colorblind race conversation. And what this chapter does is this chapter complicates it by saying, no, not necessarily, because if we compare the Black middle class to the Black poor, then obviously there's a level of privilege there. If you were compare the Black middle class to the white middle class, you will see some huge wealth disparities, you will see some huge income disparities, and you will see some huge differences in the level in the middle class experience that can exist for Black people and for white people. So that's what we're going to talk about. And then we're going to ease out of that, and then we're going to go into this notion of cultural appropriation. So yeah, let's get started. So if we go to the first slide, Black people have money now, so why are they still complaining? Exploring the fragility of the Black middle class. The first thing that I want to do is talk a little bit about the history of the Black middle class. And typically, when we talk about the history of the Black middle class, you have to type in, if you're interested in this, if you want to do your own research, you have to type in or go back to what is called the Black bourgeoisie. And the Black bourgeoisie actually dates back to or finds its roots in the interracial or mulatto enslaved children of the 17th and 18th centuries. So when enslaved Africans were first brought to the Americas, obviously there were, and we've talked about this before, there were situations that happened, consequences where oftentimes enslaved African women would get raped by white men, by European men, and this would lead to mulatto, what they call mulatto or mixed race children. And so these mixed race children would then be born on the plantation, and they would be a mixture of the Black African woman and the white European male. So they were called mulattoes, and sometimes they were enslaved. But oftentimes what you will find with these mulatto children is that by law, they were supposed to be enslaved because the social status, according to the legal documents in America and the legal precedent in America, a person follows the social status of the mother. And so because of that, by law, these children were supposed to be enslaved. However, oftentimes the father of the children would I don't want to say oftentimes, sometimes they would find it difficult to enslave their own child or have their child subject to the same cruelties as other enslaved people on the plantation. So sometimes they would give them privileges and they would give them advantages that other enslaved people didn't have. For example, a white father, white captor would allow for their son or daughter to learn how to read. But all of the other enslaved Africans on the plantation would not be allowed to read. Sometimes they would be allowed to work in the house as opposed to working in the field, while the other ones would have to work in the field. And so these are some of the things that separated the mulatto mixed race children on the plantation from the other enslaved Africans. Well, as we get closer to the Civil War, and as we're getting closer to slavery being eradicated altogether, at least chattel slavery, more and more of these mulatto children and these mixed race children are becoming part of what we call the free Black population in the antebellum South. So there's a very small free Black population in the antebellum South. Many of them would, a lot of them would eventually migrate to places like New Orleans, Louisiana, other places in Florida. And these would be African Americans who were able to purchase their freedom, or they were given their freedom many times because they were mulatto, because they were mixed race. And sometimes this would be done if the father was getting ready to die. And so right before he would die on his deathbed, many times he would just free all of his children. This small free Black population started to grow in the antebellum South. And this mixed race free Black community would be very different from the enslaved ones. Sometimes they would still be poor, but many times they had a certain capital advantage. These people were allowed to buy farms. These people were allowed to own property. They were allowed to learn a trade. They were allowed to read. And these were things that a lot of the enslaved Black people could not do. Now, the enslaved Black people was a majority of the Black population. And this small free group had this small advantage that would end up being a bigger advantage later. So because they could read, because they could learn a trade, because they were able to own land, this set them apart from the masses of Black people that were still enslaved. And so mixed race house enslaved people were able to gather these skills like cooking, tailoring, working in the fields, and then this would later allow them, after the Civil War and after the eradication or the emancipation of enslaved people in the United States, at least chattel slavery, After it would lead to that, these people who had these skills were able to land jobs. In fact, many times they were able to get jobs quicker than poor white people because they had had these skills for a much longer time, and they were willing to work for a lower price. They were willing to work for a lower compensation, right? And so oftentimes they were able to parlay these skills into jobs and parlay these jobs into careers and into businesses that would then later allow for them to open their own businesses. So this is what a lot of times what would happen in the South. And then in the North, you would have these small businesses and even newspapers that would get started by Black people, free Black people, and they were able to get a head start on Black people, particularly when it came to owning land. So this small but very significant advantage over generations allowed for a group of people within the larger Black population to be known as the Black bourgeoisie. And so essentially what you would have is you would have these, this small Black population who would get jobs, who would have careers, who would gain money, who would save money, who would invest that money, use those investments and use that capital to then gain more money. And then when they would have children, they would be able to give their children a lot more than they had when they started. And then their children would start at a certain class advantage. Even though they were Black, they were able to start at a certain class advantage. And then that would then allow for them to get access into certain schools. And we're going to talk about the school part in a second, into certain schools, into certain social clubs, into certain parts, into certain areas of social life that would give them a head start in terms of mobility. Also, they would have a financial or an economic nest egg that was something that was not even thought of in the larger Black population. So this very small group coming out of the mixed race children, the mulattoes who had that one advantage of being able to read, being able to learn a skill, then parlaying that into a job, parlaying that into a business, using that to help set their next generation up for opportunities, would then coincide with, and if you go to the next slide, you'll see, it would then coincide with education. And so around the end of the Civil War and during Reconstruction, the United States government started something called the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau was created to help transition these freedmen. These were enslaved Black people who are now free. They were called freedmen, to transition these freedmen from being enslaved to being part of the American population, to being part of American society. Money was set aside to provide for them so that many of them could start businesses, so that some of them can own land, so that many of them, but particularly for them to be able to get an education. And so a large part of the Freedmen's Bureau was set aside so that colleges could be built specifically for these freedmen. These colleges would be known as historically Black colleges and universities. Sometimes these are called HBCUs, right? There's one right here in Jacksonville, Florida. It's Edward Waters College. I want to say that is the first historically Black college in the state of Florida. There are other ones in the state of Florida. There's other ones all across the United States. You may know a few, you may not. But this came out of the tradition from the Freedmen's Bureau. And then you also had a few that were actually started by well-to-do Black people that just decided to start schools. Typically, they would start in the basement of churches, and then they would grow into schools and colleges and universities over the decades. And so these Black colleges began to operate shortly after the Civil War. Some of them were located in the North. Many of them started to become located in the South. Most of your historically Black colleges that are still in existence now are located in the South. And so you have a few like Tuskegee University, Fisk University, Clark Atlanta, Spelman, Morehouse. Many of these many of these historically Black colleges. And so clearly, if even at that time, in order to attend a college or university, a person had to be able to pay tuition. So more often than not, the people who were able to attend these colleges and universities and gain this level of higher education, usually these were people who were already advantaged in some way. And who were the people that I said were already advantaged during this time? These were the mixed race, the mulatto children, right? Typically, these were the ones who had already knew how to read, already had jobs, already had skills. And so they were able, if they were adults or older, they had money now to send their children to those schools. Or if they were young adults, they were able to pay and go to those schools. And so essentially the historically Black college and university tradition was kind of set up, maybe not purposefully, maybe it was purposefully, who knows, was kind of set up for already privileged Black people to be able to be even more successful. So those who attended those schools acquired even more skills, got even more academic knowledge, which put them in a very distinct class, right? And so people like that would be folks like W.E.B. Du Bois, right? He would be considered part of the Black bourgeoisie. Maybe even people like Carter G. Woodson. I don't know if you know who Carter G. Woodson is, but he's considered the father of Black history, the founder of Black History Month. Definitely somebody who will be considered part of the Black bourgeoisie. Other people that were part of the Harlem Renaissance, you may know Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston for sure. She was a part of the Black bourgeoisie in Florida, and many, many others. And all of these people were people who attended college, who had the money to attend college, and some of them were mixed race, right? So this will put these people in a larger class. They will be seen as leaders of their race. Some of these people would use their leadership skills and their leadership position to then be able to get into the rooms of white leaders, presidents, mayors, politicians, to be able to negotiate opportunities for Black people. And so, and then sometimes they use these opportunities for themselves or for their own individual wealth building and their own individual advancement. Another vehicle that the Black bourgeoisie often use and to achieve economic mobility and to achieve social success is Greek letter organizations. So some of you may be familiar with Greek letter organizations. There are Black Greek letter organizations, then there are your mainstream or white Greek letter organizations, and they tend to function differently in some ways. Some ways they're the same, and then some ways they tend to function differently, different traditions. And so the Greek letter organizations within the Black community were absolutely these groups that were created, that were established, and oftentimes it was used to help parlay and allow for people who joined those organizations to have access to opportunities, jobs, careers, knowledge, skills that would allow them to continue to rise in terms of their status. And then there are other organizations like Jack and Jill of America, Links, 100 Black Men. All of these are groups that are used by the Black bourgeoisie, now we call the Black middle class, that are used to, again, help in their advancement. Also, some of these groups also use their status, their financial backing, to also help the larger Black group, right? To help the larger race. But there's always that kind of contention, which is, I don't go too much into it in this chapter, but in other parts of my research I do, that kind of leads to the tension or the contention of if the Black middle class or the Black elite or the Black bourgeoisie, those Black people that have been privileged to attend universities, to be a part of these social groups, to have money, to have resources, do they use this money to help their own people? do they use this money to give back? Do they use their resources and their networks to uplift the entire race? And so that's always been a part of the conversation ever since the Black bourgeoisie first came into existence in the middle part of the 19th century, right? So also one of the things I want to say is that there is a difference between what we call the Black elite, I would say, and in the Black middle class. And so the Black elite would be, you know, typically those people. I don't know if you've heard of Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson is who's one of the richest people in the United States. And definitely, I think he's the richest Black person in the United States, worth over about $6 billion. Just paid off a lot of loans for some students at a historically Black college and university in Atlanta, at Morehouse College there. And he would be considered the Black elite, right? People like Oprah Winfrey, people like Barack Obama, who, even though he's not a billionaire, Barack Obama is elite because of the fact that he's a former president. So people who hold a certain Black people who are part of that kind of 1% that have a lot of money or a lot of control or a lot of pull, a lot of networks, and are able to use that to negotiate power, typically is considered the Black elite. And then you have like the upper Black middle class or the Black upper class, right? Or the upper class would be those very, very rich, you know, usually millionaires, Black folks. And then you have like the middle class. So the Black middle class would be your doctors, your lawyers, your CEOs, professionals who, you know, may or make money in the millions, but probably well into the six figures. This would be like your Black middle class, right? But then there are these kind of groups within class, and we're not going to go all deep into that, right? This is kind of like a general discussion, and we're not going to go too deep, but maybe in another race class we would. In a social stratification class I would, which is where I pull some of this information from, but we're not going to go too deep into that right now. So when we talk about class, we're talking about it when we're talking about the Black middle class, we're talking about a very broad group. But in other parts of the research, it does get broken down and separated and fragmented into even smaller groups. So when we talk about the Black middle class, we are talking about people, you know, ranging from maybe six figures or a comfortable salary, all the way to, you know, maybe in the lower part of the millions, right? And then also people who have a certain educational level, or who have certain networks or are able to move in certain circles, which is kind of, you know, take all of those people and, you know, into this larger conglomerate of the Black middle class. So the next section, the next slide, it's called Black equals poverty. So even though, oh, wait a minute. Oh, yeah, this is what I'm supposed to be. So for a long time, Blackness was synonymous with poverty. And the reason why was because the masses of Black people in the United States were people who were impoverished, right? If you talk about during Jim Crow, if you talk about the early part of the 20th century, this idea of a large Black middle class did not exist. It was about 10% maybe of the population, of the Black population. W.E.B. Du Bois called them the talented 10th. Where he said basically the 10% of the people who were able to go to college, able to get jobs, able to have their own businesses, these were the intellectual leaders of the Black community, and they would then be used to help lead Black people all together into freedom and into equality in the United States. And so if 10% are of the talented 10th, then obviously there's 90% who are more so working class and poor. So generally, Blackness was kind of synonymous with poverty during the early part of the 20th century. But as you go closer to the middle part of the 20th century, and as the civil rights, or there is becoming an environment for which the civil rights movement can blossom, you start to see more and more Black people having opportunities and finding ways to make money and own businesses and become successful. So it's growing gradually from the early part of the 20th century till about 1930, 1940, maybe even 1950. You actually start to see more and more middle-class Black people, even to the point where by the time you get to Dr. King being born, Dr. King being in his 20s, shortly before the Brown v. Board of Education case, he's actually attending a church, or he's pastoring a church that is predominantly Black middle class, predominantly teachers and lawyers and doctors and educators and professionals in what part of Alabama was that? Mobile, was it Mobile? Montgomery, Alabama, right? So more and more Black people are starting to become middle class. They have their own sections of the city. They have their own churches. And so that is what's happening. Again, once the civil rights movement kicked off, and I think we've talked about this before, the civil rights movement began to open doors and push for a lot of opportunities for Black people. It was kind of couched for all Black people. And so you have the 64 Civil Rights Act, you have the 65 Voting Rights Act, you have the 68 Fair Housing Act, you have the 69 Poor People's Campaign, you have the War on Poverty, you have the creation of welfare, you have, well, actually the welfare program was started with the Great Depression, but you have Head Start programs that happened during that time. So the civil rights movement opened up a lot of opportunities, right? So that Black people did not just have to go to historically Black colleges and universities to attend school. Now they have the opportunity to go to a Harvard, a Yale, a Princeton, a Columbia, USC, UNF, University of Florida. Now they have these opportunities largely because of the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement opened doors for Black people in terms of education, in terms of housing. Now Black people are able to move into neighborhoods that were predominantly white and are now and now they're able to move into these areas, buy these homes, and then able to sell these homes at a ridiculous, profit. What a lot of people don't understand, though, is that these opportunities for Black people, most of them did not trickle down to the Black working class and the Black poor. These opportunities were generally felt and benefited from by the Black middle class. People who already had money, all they needed was the opportunity. All they needed was the Jim Crow laws to come down so that they can actually capitalize on it. But if you were poor, it doesn't matter if the Jim Crow laws exist or not. It doesn't matter if it's a white only sign or not. I can't afford to go I can't afford to eat there. I can't afford to go in the neighborhood anyway. Even if you take the white only sign down and you allow for Black people to go to Harvard, I can't afford the tuition, so I can't go. So poor and working class people still really didn't benefit much from what was happening with the civil rights movement. Maybe a little bit, but nowhere near as much as the Black middle class. However, the Black middle class were now able to take these opportunities, go to these Ivy League schools, go to these predominantly white institutions, get these jobs, move into these neighborhoods, and now the Black middle class has grown even more. And so now the Black middle class makes up about a quarter of the Black population, right? Which still leaves about 75% poor and working class, but that's a lot more than the 10% that existed about a century ago, right? And I would probably argue that due to the tech boom of the 21st century, due to the tech boom, I would love to see recent research that lets us know kind of where we are in terms of how much of the Black population is middle class. So it would appear that the civil rights movement was a success. Yes, the poor and working class continue to suffer, but look, the Black middle class has grown. Because of that, they got opportunities. They getting money. Everything looks good. Doesn't that mean that the system is working? Doesn't that mean that the U.S. has done what it said that it was going to do and provide equal opportunity for everybody? Or at least we made a lot of advancement, because look at all these Black people who are on TV and who are now your professors and your doctors and your lawyers and your teachers and your businessmen and your politicians. They're everywhere. So why are we marching? Why are we complaining? What's going on? What is the problem? You all are everywhere. And so that's where we go into taking a deeper dive and taking a deeper look into what we mean when we talk about the Black middle class, particularly in its relationship to the white middle class. So if we go to the next slide, we see that in general, still to this day, when people talk about, if you ask somebody if they live in a Black neighborhood, most of the time the thing that comes to their head is, if they say, if I were to tell you, yes, I live in a Black neighborhood, most people would think, oh, okay, they would picture in their mind a neighborhood that may or may not be, may be run down, or if it's not run down, it's not very, very nice, right? Not as nice as a white neighborhood. If a person were to say they live in a Black neighborhood, a lot of times what may come to their mind is a place of poverty, is a place where there may not be a lot of resources, a place where there may be some crime. There's something that comes to mind, right? In general, it's not to say that all Black people live in these areas, but in order for a Black person to not experience that, the idea is that they have to be around white people or live in a white neighborhood. And so this idea that Blackness in general equals poverty, and if somebody were to say that they were middle class, a person will automatically think, oh, this person must be white, or this person can be a person of color who has adopted white ideas and a white way of thinking and a white way of behaving. So there is still this notion that Blackness is equal to poverty and middle classness is equal to whiteness. And so my question to you is, when you think about the middle class, what are some of the indicators that come to your mind? What are some of the things that come to your mind when you think about middle class status? And you can pause the video here if you need to. Some of the things that you may have thought about were private schools. Typically, a middle class person can send their child to a private school, right? You may think about extracurricular activities, right? Typically, they'll be able to afford that. You may think about a person with multiple cars or a family with multiple cars, everybody having access to one car. You may think about a suburban neighborhood. You may think about a trust fund or some type of fund where there is some money being put aside for a child's future. You will think about college education. Typically, a person who is of a middle class status probably has a college education. It's not to say everybody in middle class does, but that, again, we're just generalizing. So these are examples of what we think of. These are the things we think about when we think about middle class status: higher education, suburban neighborhood, certain things that you might have, vacations, being able to take vacations. That's something that typically a middle class person would be able to do. So then what is the example of the black middle class? What does that look like? And so I want you to click on this link and I want you to watch this and then come back. So many people see this as the example of the Black middle class, something like Blackish, right? Some of you may have seen the show. Some of you may have seen clips of it if you've ever watched it, but it's a popular show on ABC. And many people would say, yeah, this is a Black middle class family. The father is an executive in marketing. The mother is a doctor. I think she's an anesthesiologist or something, but she's a doctor, right? So clearly they make a lot of money, are able to afford a big house in California. In this clip, they are on vacation. They're making jokes about what they're about to do with their money and eating at a fancy restaurant and all kinds of things, right? They have multiple kids. And if you've ever watched the show, obviously there's tests and trials and different things that happen, but never have I ever seen an episode where money was an issue, right? Never was money an issue. So many people see this as an example of the Black middle class, right? Or if you're a little older, maybe like the Cosby Show or something, right? And also both of the parents attended college. The father attended a historically Black college and the mother attended a predominantly white college. And at one point, the Black middle class was a reflection of the American middle class. At one point, you could look at the Black middle class and say, okay, they look like the white middle class. They kind of live the same lives, maybe it's similar. Maybe there is going to be some level of equality, at least among the middle class of Black and white people. So if at one point they were headed towards being on the same level, then what happened? Let's go to the next slide. And I want you to click that link. So then what happened? And so you see, after looking at that, you see that there becomes this almost attack on the American middle class structure in general. And in December 2015, Pew Research Center released this report demonstrating that the number of households earning a middle class income had reached its lowest point in over 40 years. You start to see that in general, the middle class is starting to suffer, especially in the 1980s and in the 1990s. And we're going to go more into that. We have a couple of charts we're going to look at that explain that even more. And the decline is due in part to the middle class getting smaller because the distribution of wealth got bigger. Less and less wealth was being spread across class groups, and more wealth was being concentrated among the who? The upper class, particularly that top 1%. And so as the distribution started to grow, so did income inequality. At one point in the 60s and 70s, the Black middle class was, the American middle class was solid. But it was around the 1980s during what was called Reaganomics, where you start to see more and more resources being pushed towards the larger 1%. The super wealthy, in hopes that that wealth would, what they call trickle down economics, and hope that that wealth would trickle down. But what ended up happening was that super wealthy then took that money, closed the opportunities down for the Black middle class and the Black working, the middle class and the working class, and then move their businesses elsewhere and begin to use that money to then make more money for themselves. So a lot of families began to move from being middle class to being some of the lower earners of our society. So then the question is asked, well, then why? Okay, so we're talking about the larger middle class, American middle class, regardless of race. Why is this important to the Black middle class? Well, there's a saying among Black people that says, when America catches a cold, Black people get pneumonia. And what do you think they mean by that? When America catches a cold, Black people get pneumonia. And basically what that means is when something negative happens to the country, because Black people are already at a disadvantaged position, they're going to be hurt even, the negative consequences will be felt by them even more so, because they're already at a disadvantage. And so that's essentially what happened with the middle class. As the middle class began to shrink, the Black middle class began to suffer even more, particularly their neighborhoods. I want you to click on this link and I want you to look at what is talked about with this Black middle class family. And I want you to answer, what are some of the structural issues affecting the Black middle class based on what you see in this link? So you can pause the video, do that, and so as you can see, the Black middle class, oftentimes, because of these larger structural oppressions or larger structural limitations and barriers of poverty, of residential segregation, of the lack of a social safety net, the lack of an economic safety net, the limited possibilities, limited wealth opportunities. All of these things keep the Black middle class at a disadvantage. So then when something goes wrong, they're the ones that are more likely to feel the issue. So even in middle class Black neighborhoods, they still have to deal with nearby poverty. They still have to deal with rising crime. Things that oftentimes the middle class white people don't have to deal with. And so if we go to the next slide, we start to see that there are these different identities that the Black middle class have. One is this public identity, where middle class Black people do not shield Black people from being middle class, does not shield Black people from being discriminated against. Middle class Black people are still denied service, harassed by the police, accosted while shopping. And that's one thing that you read in my book chapter. This is something that middle class white people don't often have to deal with, usually because they're already assumed to be middle class. They're already treated as if they have economic opportunities. And so these public identities means that for African-American middle class people, even though they may look the part, even though they may be the part, oftentimes they still have to put up with the same things that poor and working class Black people have to put up with: being denied service, being harassed by the police, being accosted while shopping. And so even if we go to Black Lives Matter, even if we go to the history of Black Lives Matter and the history, or at least the recent history of Black men and women being hurt or killed by the police, by law enforcement, many of these things happen in predominantly middle-class neighborhoods. Trayvon Martin came from a fairly middle-class family. His dad lived in a very nice neighborhood in Sanford, Florida. All right. And that's where he was murdered. I think his name was Jonathan Edwards. He was a football player for Florida A&M University. So I imagine if he went to college, parents could maybe came from a good family. Not a good family, but a middle-class family. He was shot because he was asking for help because he got in a car accident and it was late. And some people shot him. And these aren't the only examples. There are many, many others. Many, many others. Unfortunately, a large number of these do happen to more so poor and working class Black people, but being middle class does not shield a person from being killed. Now, sometimes it can also not shield them from being discriminated against. And if you read the chapter, what were some of the examples that I gave? One example was Oprah Winfrey. Oh, she was in another country. A woman didn't know who she was. Oprah asked to see a purse. It's like 20-something thousand dollars. The lady said, "Are you sure you can afford it?" In the United States, we know Oprah Winfrey. That would never happen to her here. But she was treated as if she could not afford something that clearly she can. Henry Louis Gates. He's an African-American studies professor at Harvard University. He's a part of the Black elite. He has counseled presidents, and not just the Black one. He is one of the leading scholars on American history in the country. And he was accused of breaking in his own home because the people in his neighborhood in Boston didn't think he lived there. And the police arrested him, even when he showed them his Harvard ID and showed them that he was who he said he was. Still arrested him. And there are many, 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 many other. There are other examples that were given in the chapter. So this goes to show that middle class does not hide or mitigate the level of racial discrimination that Black people tend to face. So I want you to look at these examples from these two links. Oftentimes, Black people cannot enjoy the lifestyle of being middle class as their white counterparts. Many of their white counterparts are able to live in certain neighborhoods, drive certain cars in certain neighborhoods. But if their Black middle class counterparts do the same, they may be met with discrimination. So I want you to look at those links and then come back. And so you see in those examples, you see where people, and this is the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, you see where he had to use his uncle, who's a lawyer, and his aunt, who's a college professor, to help get him out of jail because he was falsely accused of stealing a car because they didn't believe they thought he stole the car. And then even the middle class mother and father still had to have the white middle class colleague to come in and speak for them. So even then, his position, his education, his social status still didn't matter, because all that the police officer could see was the fact that this man and this woman were of African descent. And so these are the types of things that oftentimes middle-class Black people have to face. So oftentimes what middle-class Black people end up doing is they end up acquiring what they call cultural capital. They end up buying clothing or learning the language or having the mannerisms of the larger white middle class in order to show them this public identity that they are not like their poor or working class Black brothers and sisters. They dress with care. They show that they belong so that hopefully they don't get treated like that anymore. And how do they acquire this cultural capital? Sometimes they acquire it through school, watching white people doing what they do, going to certain networks or groups and learning and trying to acquire these middle class mannerisms to separate themselves from the Black working class and the Black poor, if at the very least, just in front of white people or in front of white people with white authority figures like the police. Okay, so going to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about, or go more into this lag that we talked about of the Black families, so that we can show that, again, even when we're talking about being middle class, race still brings about disparities even among class. And so Black families in this chart says lags behind despite some signs of growth. So Black households, by and large, have seen gains in their real income since 1979. So in 1979, you see that small dot there. And by 2014, it's grown quite dramatically, which is good. So I guess you would say the average race and income quintile 2014 for a Black family is almost maybe $140,000. Cool. Cool. But Black households still lag substantially behind white households because the average white race and income quintile is $200,000. In fact, Black families in 2014, if we look at where the dots are located, the mean income for the top Black quintile in 2014 is almost the same as the average income for white folks in 1979, before I was born. So that's what we mean when we say lag behind. That means that Black people are lagging behind white folks in terms of average middle class status. 79, 89, 99, 2009, and then that's 14, that's 35 years. 35 years. It took them 35 years to make what white people made 35 years before. So again, if you just look at race and class, it may look like there's progress. But if you compare it to other racial groups in class, not so much. Let's also look at some more gains for Black families that may be positive but less stable. So Black families' financial gains are positive, but they are not necessarily secure. Let's see what happens. Remember when we talked about when America catches a cold, Black folks get pneumonia. Let's see what happens when there's a shake. When everything is going good, it might be all right, but let's see what happens when there's a shake, when that cold comes. So the real median income for all Americans peaked around 1999. So as you can see, if you look at white folks in 1979, it was higher than Black folks, and it was about the national average. So, that goes without saying. But you start to see a growth. And around 1990, you start to see a growth in everybody's. But guess what happens in 99? There's actually equality. There's actually some level of equality. In fact, if we go to about 2000, 2001, we actually see where the national average, Black people, at least for that small time, maybe for that year, is actually above white folks and above the national average. But it's not stable. It just as quickly as it rose, you see it quickly fell back down. But then what happens with this? There's a huge dip right here. Between what years do you see this huge dip? Those years, 2009 to 2014. What happened during those times? What was going on? That was the recession. That was the recession. And when the recession hit, you see a drop in the national average, quite naturally. You see a drop in white income, quite naturally. But the drop in Black income was much, much larger. But Black households have had this large relative decrease in their earnings, especially post 2011 or post Great Recession, falling by 14%, where the white families only fell by 7%. Okay, let's look at another chart. So despite holding less wealth overall, Black households also hold a larger share of their wealth in home ownership than white households. Some people may say, well, that's good. That means Black people are buying homes, they're investing in property, yeah. But what happens when the housing bubble happens? When the crash happens? So this hurts them even more during a housing crisis. Let's also look at this other chart. Black families are more likely to give or lend larger shares of money to relatives. So some people say, well, how come is it that Black people can have all of this income, but can never seem to get the wealth gap? Are they not saving money? Are they spending it on Jordans and rims? No. There's so many reasons, so many structural reasons as to why this occurs. But the one that we're looking at here is the fact that oftentimes middle-class Black people are the ones in their family that everybody goes to for financial support, as opposed to middle-class white people who oftentimes come from middle-class white mothers and fathers, or they have middle-class white grandmothers and grandfathers. So they're not the ones that are oftentimes being financially responsible for the whole family. Because the family has money and the family is established, you don't need to borrow money from them. So all their money they can keep and grow and pass on to their kids. But oftentimes with middle-class Black parents and children and families, they're giving money to their mothers, they're giving money to their fathers, they're taking care of a brother or a sister or an aunt or an uncle or somebody. And then taking the little bit they have left for themselves and then a tiny bit that they can and passing it forward to their children. But with white middle-class families, because they don't have to take care of all those families in the back, they can keep a good portion of their money and save it and invest it and then pass a large sum to their children. So again, we're talking about structural issues like familial poverty that is more likely to negatively affect Black families over white families. So in conclusion to this part, perhaps even worse, a quarter of Black children will make less than 80% of what their parents did. Now, to be fair, they did say that other research has shown that the numbers won't be as high for white children, but they say that this is the first generation that will more than likely make less than what their parents made. Because generally, you're supposed to be doing better. So you're supposed to do better than how your parents did. So but the percentages are much larger for Black people. And so these racial differences in mobility are largely affected by childhood test scores, gaps in test scores, that say less about innate abilities, but more about the differences in the quality of schooling. So we have to look at education as a means, quality, equal education as a means to help dealing with these issues. And so essentially the solution is that America needs a healthy and thriving middle class to support its economy. And then large portions of the middle class, by not thriving, actually are struggling to keep the pace, just to hold on. And so policies and practices must be supported that allow for the Black middle class to hold on to the gains and prosperities of the larger American middle class. Having those things specifically, and some of those were created like policies that supported historically Black colleges and universities, policies that allow for first-time homeowners to get tax credits. So there have been some policies that have been created, and we definitely need more. Okay. All right, so we'll stop right here, take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk about cultural appropriation. All right. So now let's jump into talking about cultural appropriation. First of all, what is cultural appropriation? When you think about that term, what is cultural appropriation? And what is the difference between cultural appropriation and admiration or acknowledgement? All right, so let's look at a few examples of this idea of cultural appropriation before we get into what it is and a larger discussion about it. So what we see here is we see this white woman, and she white, I guess, presenting, and she is dressed in Native American garb. There's a Native American headdress on that she's wearing. There's this other example of what I assume to be Katy Perry, and she is dressed in some Asian wear, right? And then we have these people who are dressed in, it looks like they're white people, but they are dressed in, they have on an Afro wig, and they have on black paint on their faces, and they also have on some African wear. And so we see these examples. We also see an example, I think it's either Beyonce or Sierra, a Black woman, that is actually wearing some kind of outfit that is looks like to be maybe of Indian, maybe Indian inspired or something of that nature. And then there is this cartoon of these white women that are wearing braids, or sometimes called cornrows. And so a person might ask, well, when is it cultural appropriation? And then when is it admiration or acknowledgement? Some people may say that this white woman wearing this Native American headdress, or Katy Perry dressing in an Asian wear, is appropriation. But others may say they could be just celebrating that particular culture. These women wearing cornrows or braids may be looked at as just celebrating culture. So how do we know when it's cultural appropriation and when someone is just celebrating another culture? Especially when we also see people who are minorities are doing this with other minority cultures. So let's take a deeper dive into what this means, cultural appropriation. So cultural appropriation happens when a member of the dominant status group is praised for doing something a subordinate group member would be othered for. So a lot of times, and so there's different descriptions of cultural appropriation. One of them is not, doesn't necessarily exist when a person of a dominant group does something or imitates something from a person of a minority group. So it's not just about imitating, but it's also about gaining credit for being an initiator of a particular idea or style. So when a member of the dominant group is praised for doing something that the person of the minority group would be seen as being othered for, that's the problem. So for example, if we go back to the previous slide, and we see these white women with the cornrows or the braids, that would be an example of cultural appropriation, because historically, Black women who have worn braids or cornrows have been told that their hairstyle is not intact. It's not professional. It should be taken down. It is not a hairstyle for the workplace. And so Black people have been scrutinized and criticized and othered for wearing that hairstyle. But then if a white person wears that hairstyle, it is seen as being unique and being ethnic and being edgy, right? So that is one example of cultural appropriation. And when we say othering, what we're saying is when a subordinate group is seen as being culturally or intellectually inferior, right? So saying that whatever their cultural style is less than the cultural style of the dominant group, or saying that they're intellectually inferior is to say that their mindset or their ideas is seen as less than the ideas or the mindset of the larger group. And so that's what we mean when we say being other. Explicitly or implicitly providing or labeling a certain subordination to a particular already othered, already minority or marginalized group. Cultural appropriation also happens when members of the dominant group are given credit for something they did not create. And so some people have looked at the wearing of the braids. We're still using that example from the previous slide, the wearing of the braids, and saying, oh, this is a new style. And so when someone says, oh, this is a new style, then that gives them credit for creating the style, when braids and Black people wearing braids and African people doing braids in each other's hair dates back centuries, dates all the way back to Africa prior to the slave trade. And so cultural appropriation happens when something that a minority group has done for centuries and centuries or years or decades is not seen as valuable, but then a white person or a white group does that same thing and they're seen as being the progenitors, right? And so that's what we mean when we say cultural appropriation. That's another way in which cultural appropriation happens. Okay, and then also when individuals dress up as cultures, not their own, and exaggerate features of another's culture, which can be offensive. So for example, if we look at this example of the Black people or the white people wearing the blackface with the afros, afro wigs, some people may say, well, maybe they're just supporting or acknowledging Black culture. But there's this exaggeration of the lips, there's this exaggeration of the smile, there's this exaggeration of the afro wig that does not appear to be something that people of African descent, particularly African Americans, look at as being something that is celebrated, but it actually looks like a caricature. It looks like they are making fun of African Americans by wearing what they're wearing. You also have this white woman who's wearing this Native American headdress. And so you have this kind of overly large headdress that is being worn by this woman. And it can be looked at as cultural appropriation because in actual Native American culture, in order for someone to wear that particular headdress, oftentimes they would have had to go through a series of steps. They would have had to go through some type of maturation process. They would have to reach a certain age or perform a certain task or have a certain level of skills to be a leader in order to wear what this woman decided to wear just because she wanted to look a certain way. And so there's just kind of a lack of respect for what took place in order to be able to wear that headdress. It's very similar to if a person joins a fraternity or a sorority. You typically have to go through a certain process, whether it be a hazing process, not physically, hopefully there's no physical hazing, but there's a process, there's a learning curve, there are things that you have to go through in order to be able to wear those letters, join that organization, represent those symbols. And if someone were to just put those symbols on or wear those colors with those symbols or wear those letters, then that would be seen as a sign of disrespect because those people did not go through the process in order to have the privilege of wearing that. And so we see that same thing happening here with cultural appropriation. And then lastly, we also have cultural appropriation happens when the culture of an oppressed group is taken on by the dominant group. The significance of the culture is often left out of the adaptation. So again, going back to the feathers on a Native American headdress, a lot of times that significance is left out when the dominant group takes on that culture. And so those are examples of what we mean when we say cultural appropriation. And so the larger effect is that the culture of the dominant group remains intact and elevated and superior, but then the culture of the oppressed group oftentimes gets watered down and sometimes even eradicated as a whole. And so the dominant culture is the culture in power. It is the culture with the most economic power, the most social power, the most political power, and it is a category that oftentimes becomes the reference category when we're talking in public discourse or even when we're talking in research. And so it is the category that everybody else is compared to. All right. If there's research happening, it's white being normal and then everybody else. If it's a gender conversation, it's cis male being normal and then everybody else. If it's a sexuality conversation, it's heterosexual people being normal and everybody else. So the dominant culture is that main culture that everybody else is compared to. And so with cultural appropriation, you have this dominant culture who then takes on another culture. Their own culture is still intact. Their own culture and their ideas and their traditions and their norms are still held intact. But then there is this kind of taking away, this kind of whitenizing, this kind of watering down of another person's culture and group. And this is one of the main kind of descriptions of cultural appropriation. So during what time of the year does cultural appropriation most often occur? When do you think cultural appropriation most often occurs? What time of the year? Probably Halloween, right? When people are dressing up in costumes, and this is the time where some people use this as an example, not an example, but as a reason or an excuse to wear certain things that normally would be seen as taboo. And then what is the most common example of cultural appropriation that we also see outside of Halloween? What is another big example of cultural appropriation? Most of us watch it every week, sometimes even multiple times a week. If you go to the next slide, you will see it's in sports, right? I mean, even if we look at mascots, we can start with Florida. Florida State University has been under scrutiny for years for the symbol, the mascot of the Seminoles. And even if we assess the actual symbol, we can see where it's problematic. Number one, the symbol looks like a white man. The person has white skin. So already it doesn't look like a real Seminole. All right? It just looks like a white person with their eyes closed. Number two, this symbol has been used on a university that is majority white. that has been put in place to help advance white people and white privilege. And very little opportunities have been available for Native American people. Because of the protests, though, and not just the protests by Native Americans, because that's one of the issues, is that because there's so few of them left, oftentimes they don't have as much of a say in the market to economically boycott a place. Oftentimes they don't have that much of a say in media to make enough noise to bring attention to something. And so usually Native Americans have to tag along or have to unify with other minority groups so that they can get their voices and their grievances out. Generally, what you'll find is Black folks, especially because Black people and Native Americans have a long history of coalescing, right? Of working together. So now there has been money set aside for Native American people in scholarships for Native American people to attend Florida State University. But that few, I don't know how much money, maybe a few $100,000, maybe a few million, is nothing compared to the billions of dollars that the university has made, largely off of this symbol or connected to this symbol. Same thing with the Cleveland Indians. If we look at this mascot, it's extremely racist because Native Americans have been seen as red men, and this man is very red, extremely red, with this large smile on his face, right? With the feather in his head. It just looks like a very costumey caricature, an exaggerated version of a Native American. And then the term Indian is already problematic because these people were not Indian. These people did not come from India. That is where Christopher Columbus thought they came from. So that is another example of why this is problematic. Then we see the Land O'Lakes butter. You have this woman who really looks white, but dressed in Native American attire, and she is in this humbling, subservient position, serving the people butter. So there's this kind of race conversation as well as a gender conversation around not only Native American people, but Native American women, and how in the eyes of white culture, they are these infantile, subservient people. Right? So these are just examples. And so let's go to what we call cultural hegemony. Control of cultural production. How do people control the way in which culture is produced? Who controls it? Typically, it's controlled by the dominant culture, and the dominant culture controls these. The dominant culture controls the production of other people's culture in three ways. Number one, media. Whoever controls media helps to control culture. Number two, entertainment companies. And number three, sports teams. And these are the way in which the production of culture continues to stay largely within the control of white people. And so Patricia Hill Collins argues that these are what she calls in Black Feminist Thought. In her book, Black Feminist Thought, Patricia Hill Collins is a sociologist and a scholar and a theoretician. She says that these controlling images are designed to make racism and sexism and poverty and other forms of social injustice appear to be natural, normal, and inevitable parts of everyday life. So these controlling images are created by those who own the conduits of cultural production to continue to perpetuate and reinforce racist, sexist ideas. It is also done to make these racist and sexist ideas appear to be normal ways of thinking and normal ways of life. And so these things must be challenged and must be assessed. and not allowed to continue as if it's okay. Not allowed to continue as if it's natural, because the naturalizing of these controlling images is what then leads people to carry out violent acts based on preconceived notions about a particular people. It happened we talked about it happened in the Holocaust. It happened in 20th century, early 20th century with Black folks in the Ku Klux Klan. And it continues to happen today. And it's absolutely happened with mass incarceration. Throw out images of the people that you're looking to oppress, throw out negative images of them, and get the people to continue to see those oppressed people in that light. So let's look at page 300. This is the last slide before your assignment. So let's look at page 300. So three strategies that you can use to examine the existence of appropriation. Number one, first, assess. So ask yourself if you would be offending a culture by your actions. Most individuals are aware of their own culture, race, or ethnicity. So first, ask yourself, am I gonna offend somebody if I do this? And if you gotta ask yourself that question, you probably just should err on the side of caution and not do it. That's what I would say. Okay, but ask yourself, would you be offending a culture by your actions? And maybe even ask a few people from that culture if you have access to them. And then also, that doesn't necessarily totally absolve you from it anyway, because just because it may not offend a few people from that culture doesn't necessarily mean it won't offend other people. So again, usually if you have to ask that question, you probably shouldn't do it. Consider your social location. Becoming more aware of your own privilege will help you be more socially responsible. The more you have conversations around privilege, around racial privilege and gender privilege and class privilege and sexuality privilege, the better you can begin to understand what is right and wrong when we talk about taking on other people's cultures and identities. We have the right to express ourselves, yes, individually, but we also have a moral and ethical right to be aware that certain things should not be done if it will offend another group. And then lastly, recognize and acknowledge if the culture is not yours, it is not your place to make a claim that you are appreciating the culture or the members of the culture. So some people may say, well, this isn't cultural appropriation. I didn't mean anything by it, but it doesn't matter. If it's not your culture, you can't say whether it was appropriation or not. If the people who you are mimicking says it's appropriation, then that's what it is. So it's very important that we assess, that we consider our social location, and that we recognize and acknowledge that the people who this culture belongs to has the say. And then when your culture comes around, you have the say. So if we look at Bruno Mars, this kind of conversation around Bruno Mars, some people have said that Bruno Mars is an example of cultural appropriation because of his music. His music sounds, for lack of a better term, Black, right? And he does not deny that. He does not deny that he has been inspired by a lot of Black music from the 1970s and 1980s. And he gives a lot of, he is sure to make sure he says that in interviews. At the same time, though, he's made a lot of money off of sounding like a lot of old Black musicians and old Black bands. So some people say, well, he's just a musician. He's an artist and he likes certain type of music and he does it. And he's not lying and saying that he's making it up. He's saying, yes, a lot of this comes from that idea, and then he'll add his own spin to it, which artists do all the time. So some people say it's not a big deal. that they don't think he's appropriating. Other people say he absolutely is, because a lot of it sounds exactly like what has been played before. There's not much of a difference. He doesn't add his own originality or original style to it. And he makes so much money, wherein those people who he's mimicking did not make as much money as him, were not as successful, even though he's doing their exact same music. And both groups have a point. So I would be interested to know what you think. If you think Bruno Mars is cultural appropriation or not. Okay. All right. So for your assignment, you are required to watch the documentary below this link. It's called Braids. And as you watch the documentary, I want you to write 10 interesting facts that you learned from this piece of work. And I want you to record those facts on a separate Microsoft Word document. And you're going to upload your submission to the assignments tab that says Braids Assignment. The deadline to complete this task is April 1st, 11:59. If you're still confused, please see the lecture video for this PowerPoint where I explain it in more detail. So that's essentially what you are going to do. Write 10 interesting facts, 10 interesting details from this documentary. All right. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this lecture. I hope you have enjoyed these topics. I hope you've learned a lot. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me during my office hours. Look forward to seeing you. Have a great day, great week, great weekend.